Good evening. We'll stand before you, as always, to open God's Word together. I trust the things that we'll be talking about this evening are things that will be profitable to everyone here, that we can challenge ourselves, probably more than likely be reminded of things that you already know, but just to refresh our memories and think about important things that God, our Creator, would have us to think about. There's been a running joke that the Odoms have never heard me speak, and we've tricked them today. With Martin and I switched spots. We tricked them, and I got to trap them here this evening. But good to have you all visiting. Good to see Levi and Carrie with us as well. If you would go and turn to Matthew 20. Matthew 20, there's a story here that Jesus tells, and this is toward the end of his ministry, where he is talking, or he's approached rather, by the mother of the sons of Zebedee. I guess you could just call her the wife of Zebedee, right? Zebedee's wife. And she has a request. She kneels before him in verse 20. She wants to ask something from him, and he allows her to make her request. And she says, say that these two sons of mine are to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in your kingdom. I think sometimes when we're looking at this story, we skip straight to the correction. You know, Jesus corrects her. He really kind of puts her in her place. Remember also the disciples had been arguing on different occasions who was the greatest, and this seems to be kind of an offshoot of some of that. Perhaps the mom or the parents were encouraging that. I don't know, but what we do know is she makes this request, and this request, just before we start kind of correcting it a little bit, has a lot of faith in it. She's showing a lot of faith here because she believes that Jesus is going to sit in his kingdom. She believes Jesus is going to rule in his kingdom. That's quite a statement of faith. She had some misconceptions about that, and Jesus does kind of correct those. But that's really powerful, I think, to see. But what you see in this statement is a desire for greatness. She's wanting her sons to have this position. And as I said, from the other occasions, we see the apostles arguing about who is going to be greatest. And on this occasion, there's some amazing teaching that Jesus gives to address that desire for greatness. He's going to answer that desire for greatness. First, he says, you don't know what you're asking. You don't really comprehend what all is involved in what you're asking. He goes on to say those places, the right hand and left hand, that's for my Father to give. That's not for me to give. So Jesus is giving deference to God. He's giving deference to the Father by making that statement. But he goes on from there to talk to them about the way it's going to be in his kingdom. The main thing that they needed to know, he doesn't reveal everything to them. But he uses this, if you skip down to verse 25, to teach them a lesson about the way it's going to be in the new kingdom. He says, verse 25, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. It shall not be so among you. Whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be your slave. Even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. So he uses this desire for greatness, this desire for human accolades, for a position, to teach a lesson about what the kingdom was going to be like. And he says, in the kingdom, the one who wants to be great needs to learn how to be a servant. Needs to learn how to be a servant. If you want to be great in the kingdom, you must be the one who is serving. And so the idea that I want to run with is really kind of thinking about what that means to be a servant, to serve rather than to be served. And what the word we're going to be keen in on in building those thoughts is humility. Humility leads to true greatness. Humility in so many ways connects to everything that we do in our walk with God, everything that we do as Christians. And it's pretty powerful connection to a verse that we looked at in class this morning. We'll go there in just a second. But humility connects to everything that we're trying to do as Christians. In our relationships with God, in our relationships with our fellow man, we need to learn how to act humbly, to act with humility. So as I referenced, the verse we looked at in class this morning, 1 Peter 5 is the next verse I want us to kind of connect to these thoughts. 1 Peter 5, and this is right after he's been talking about the attitude toward elders, how we ought to, all of us, submit to the elders of the church, to submit to those in authority in the church. And then he just kind of sums it all up in verse 5, saying, clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility. Clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility, and love one another. Clothe yourselves all with humility. For God, he says, is opposed to the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. So the idea, and I'll go ahead and put it up there, of clothing ourselves with humility is what I want us to be thinking about this evening, dwelling on, meditating on. What does it look like to be clothed with humility? What does that look like in a person's life? Here Peter, through the Holy Spirit, is telling us, this is how I want you to be. I want you to live your life as those who are clothed with humility. So what does that look like? How is that observed in our day-to-day life? He tells us here a great principle we mentioned this morning in class, a quote from Proverbs 3. God is opposed to the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. He is opposed to the proud. Why is that? Why is God opposed to the proud? Why does he give grace to the humble? Then in verse 6, humble yourselves therefore under the mighty hand of God, so that he may exalt you, or at the proper time he may exalt you. We're going to come back on several of those phrases and kind of build some points around there, but I just want you to get these words in your mind. Clothe yourself with humility. God is opposed to the proud. He gives grace to the humble. And so we need to learn how to humble ourselves under God's mighty hand. Give that just a second to pop back on. So with a person who is operating with humility, if we are clothed with humility, we're just going to go through and think about what that looks like in a person's life, what that should look like in our own life. A person who is humble, a person who is clothed with humility, wants to learn what God is teaching. And key in these verses here, and I went ahead and left them up, is what are we doing? We're humbling ourselves under the mighty hand of God. We're humbling ourselves under his authority. So I want to know, what does God want from me? What does God want from me? What does he require? You know, we make this point quite often because sometimes in religion, people, they want religion kind of boiled down to a list of, what do I have to do? What is required of me? Give me the checklist. And I think that attitude is it's a wrong attitude to take. What we're really trying to do is we're trying to have a relationship with God. This attitude of humility is at the very core of that relationship. As I'm humbling myself under his hand and I'm asking, what do you want from me, God? What can I do for you, God? Not how little do I have to do, but what can I do? The idea of really putting yourself in submission to God, a desire to learn what he has for us. I wanted to connect that thought with this passage in James 1. In James 1, beginning in verse 19, he says, I know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger, for the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. And we'll just pause there for a second. Some of these verses kind of stack on each other, so I have to be careful not to skip too far ahead. But just think about those first two highlights there on the board. Quick to hear and slow to speak. Quick to hear, slow to speak. To me, that is, maybe not the whole, it's not the whole of humility, but it is at the core of humility is stop talking and listen. Stop talking and listen. If you're humbling yourself under the mighty hand of God, you are recognizing who he is, and you are putting your hand over your mouth and you're listening to him. You are listening to him. It reminds me of the passage where Job had been running his mouth for quite a few chapters. Job had been running his mouth, and then God shows up and he puts Job in his place. And Job says, my hand is over my mouth. I retract. I will say no more. He says, I'll say no more. That's the idea, is when you truly recognize who God is, you truly recognize who he is, you will stop and listen. Down in verse 21, he tells us to put away all filthiness, the rampant wickedness. All of that would be something that we would need to look into if we're humble and we want to know what God is saying. And if we're really wanting to humble ourselves under his mighty hand, we need to have studies and lessons and figure out, well, what is filthiness? What is rampant wickedness? I'm humble. We're humble. We want to learn what is that so that we can do what God is defining as these things. So I can be humble under his hand. I can listen to what his instructions are. At the end of that statement, he says, receiving with meekness the implanted word. That's such a powerful thing, is receiving the word with meekness, receiving the word in humility, recognizing that even though I may not understand it, I may not agree with it, there's aspects of it I'm not sure what God is really wanting me to get from this, but I'm going to receive it in meekness. I'm going to strive to live it. I'm going to strive to make it a part of my life. And he says this is able to save our souls. I think there's some good overlap there to Martin's lesson from this morning about obeying all of it, listening to all of it, and humility, accepting all of it. But again, the ideal of quick to hear, slow to speak. We're not going to come back to this passage, but go ahead and in your mind think about the next phrase there where he says, slow to anger, because the anger of man does not achieve the righteousness of God. There is, this I think is really at the heart of the contrast between humility and pride. A person of pride thinks that they are right, thinks that they have what they need, thinks that they're sufficient in themselves. And when, somebody tells them that they're not, or they read God's word and tells them, that's not the right way, you need to change, anger can build up. If you're prideful and you're attached to those things, then you can get angry about the word, or somebody telling you the word, asking you to change, telling you need to change. And it does not achieve that anger, that quick to speak and slow to hear, does not achieve the righteousness of God. You are driven to anger in your wickedness because you're clinging to your ways, and that will not achieve the righteousness of God. We'll connect that to another point here in just a minute. The proud resist. The proud resist. In Matthew 13, Jesus is asked why he speaks in parables. And he quotes from Isaiah, and he says, I'm speaking to them in parables because seeing they not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. And that's always kind of a head scratcher for me. I think it's worth meditating on. It's like, well, it's kind of interesting. You're speaking in parables because they don't understand. Well, don't you want them to understand? Don't you want them to get it? And there's a reality there that, it's almost like you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink principle. The gospel can only help people who are open-hearted. The gospel is only going to be able to reach people who are humble enough to listen, humble enough to have their hearts and their minds open. And Jesus is describing here as people who, they have eyes, but they don't see, and they have ears, but they don't hear. They don't understand. And he says this prophecy has been fulfilled. Verse 15, their heart has grown dull. And I'll tell you, if you want to do a study sometime and go through the scriptures and look at all the connections, all the places where he talks about people of hard-hearted or dull hearts or stiff-necked, that kind of concept, that's throughout the scripture. That is everywhere in the scripture. Well, we could spend all night putting examples on the table of this concept or this attitude being expressed in the scriptures. People that just didn't want to hear. They just didn't want to listen. And that's Jesus' point, is their heart has grown dull. Their heart has grown dull, and they will not turn. They will not listen. They will not hear. And he says if they would turn there at the end, he says, I would heal them. If they would in humility, back to the passage in James, if they would in humility receive the word implanted, it could save their soul. But they won't open their eyes, and they won't open their ears. And because of that, God, it's not that he can't save them, but he won't. He won't save them. They've chosen that. And here, I want you to connect this back to the language from 1 Peter 5. Remember where he says God is opposed to the proud? Why is God opposed to the proud? Does he just randomly pick, okay, well, I'm going to hate that attribute. I'm going to hate that attribute. I'm going to be opposed to people of that attribute. He's opposed to the proud because the proud have put themselves in opposition to him. They have put themselves in opposition to him. He has shown them the way, the truth, and the life, and the proudful person doesn't want to listen. The proudful person doesn't want to stop speaking long enough to listen. They want to do it their way, and they get angry if anybody says other than that. And so God is opposed to them because they have made themselves, they stand in opposition to the truth that could save. That's the implanted word that has to be received with meekness. That's what's able to save. But if you're too proud to listen, God's going to be opposed to you because you're not paying attention to him. You're not listening. And that's the one thing that could save you. This passage in Romans 10 describes, Paul here is speaking about some of his Jewish brethren in the flesh, people who are Jews. They had grown up in the old law just as he did, but they weren't willing to change. They weren't willing to see that Christ was the Messiah. They weren't willing to accept that. And so they were still clinging to the old law. And he says, brothers, speaking to his Christian brothers, my heart's desire and my prayer to God for them is that they may be saved. I want them to be saved. And I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God. But he says it's not in accordance with knowledge. They've got a powerful zeal, but not in accordance with knowledge. There's a great lesson in there for us. You can be zealous for something that is not God's word. You can be zealous for something that's not the implanted word that can save you. So what does he say about that? He says, being ignorant of the righteousness of God and seeking to establish their own, they did not submit themselves to God's righteousness. Now, just think about a few connections here. We went to the passage in James. If you are quick to speak and slow to hear, quick to anger, it says the anger of man doesn't achieve the righteousness of God. That's the problem these people are having. Same problem. They are seeking to establish their own righteousness. They're seeking to do it their way. And because of that, they're not submitting to God's righteousness. Remember again the passage in 1 Peter 5 where he says, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God. Humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God. That's what they're not willing to do. They're not willing to submit to his righteousness. The proud resist. The humble listen and the proud resist. And honestly, I think we could spend all night going to verses and examples of this. There's a lot of examples that you can see from this. I did want to point out verse 4 as well. It describes here in verse 4, Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. If you're humble, if you have your ears open and your mouth stopped, if you're listening for Christ, then you realize Christ is the righteousness. Christ is the implanted word that's able to save your soul. That is the truth. That is the way. Be humble enough to see that and accept that. And then you'll be willing to do whatever God commands. And this is where it really overlaps. The lesson overlaps with Martin's lesson from this morning is the humble are willing to do it. We don't, if we are humble, if we are appropriately humbling ourselves under God's mighty hand, then we will do what that word tells us to do. We will act as that word tells us to act. I wanted to put an example out there, and again, I think we could put several, but this one just really stood out to me. In 2 Kings 5, you read the story of Naaman. If you'll remember Naaman, the leper, he was from a foreign army, leader of that army, but he had leprosy, and he was told about a prophet in Israel. The slave girl told him, she says, he can help you. He can help you. And so he, I think in some ways, probably we could say he humbles himself to go to that prophet. He goes first to the king, and then the king says, no, he's not here with me. He's off on his own. So he goes and travels to that, to where the prophet was. And there in 2 Kings 5, the prophet Elisha tells him, he says, go and dip 7 times in the Jordan. And if you'll remember the way the story goes, the prophet doesn't even go out to meet him. He just sends a messenger. He sends a messenger to him. And all of that was a real affront to Naaman's pride. It was a real affront to his pride. In fact, let me put the verse up there. So in this point, all of this has happened, and it says, the text says, Naaman was angry. The anger of man. The anger of man that is not achieving the righteousness of God. It's not getting him where he needs to go, because he thought it was supposed to be this way. He says, behold, I thought he would surely come out to me and stand and call upon the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand over the place and cure the leper. You can just imagine in Naaman's mind, he was expecting some kind of pomp and ceremony and, here I am, and you ought to, really make a big deal out of curing me. And I think in the wisdom of God and the wisdom of the prophet, they knew, that wasn't going to happen. That's not the way they were going to do this. God wanted this man humbled. He wanted this man humbled. And the servant, to the servant's credit, he says, are not Abna and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than... I'm sorry, I'm still reading from Naaman. In verse 12, Naaman turned and went away in a rage. But his servant, verse 13, came and said, Father, it is a great word that the prophet has spoken to you. Will you not do it? And I want you to just think about the humility of that statement for a second. It's like, who's doing the healing here? Who has the power? Here you're upset about the what the prophet told you to do, but you came to the prophet for instruction. Are you going to humble yourself under the prophet's hand or not? Think about it. We come to God for salvation, and then we get mad when he tells us to do something we don't want to do. we come to him with our problems and ask him to help us with our problems. And he says, the solution is to live this way. The solution is to live my way. And we get angry about that. We get angry because we want to be speaking and we want to do it our way. And the servant here just says, this is a good thing that has been spoken. Will you not do it? He's humble and he's listened and he sees that this is all that needs to be done. Wash and be clean. Do what the prophet said. Humble yourself under the prophet's hand. But pride gets in the way of that. And certainly in this case, Naaman's pride got in the way. Of course, at the word of his servant, Naaman then humbles himself. He then humbles himself and is made clean, as verse 14 describes. Pride gets in the way of obedience. Lots of ways we could illustrate that. One of the best illustrations as we kind of move toward the closing of the lesson is seeing Jesus's example of obedience. And I'd like you to turn to Philippians. I'm going to have some of it up on the board, but turn to Philippians 2. I think every preacher probably has kind of a go-to text, and I'm learning about myself. Philippians 2 is one of my go-to texts. Just about every lesson, I feel like Philippians 2 ties into it. But certainly this lesson, I couldn't leave it out. In Philippians 2 and verse 8, it describes Jesus humbling himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even a death on the cross. Jesus, remember, was the one in Matthew 20 who told them, if you want to be great in the kingdom, learn how to serve. Learn how to serve. If you want to be great in the kingdom, become a servant. And here he's described as humbling himself to the point of obedience, obeying even to the point of death on a cross. This is the perfect example of humility. And you can read back up in those verses to verse 6, and you can remind yourself, he was in the form of God, verse 6. He did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped. He was willing, verse 7 says, to empty himself, taking on the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, being found in human form, and humbling himself to this point, to the point of becoming obedient. Humility is compliant, and that's what we see here from Jesus. I am going to go back in the text just a little bit, but look, if you did turn there, look at the very next verse. I didn't put this on the board. In verse 9, therefore God has highly exalted him. Therefore God has highly exalted him. Do you remember where we began in 1 Peter 5? It says, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you at the proper time. God will exalt you at the proper time. And in this text, you see that exact formula. Jesus humbled himself under the mighty hand of God, becoming obedient to the point of death. Why? Well, that was God's will for him. not his will. Jesus says, prays in the garden, not my will, but thine be done. He humbles himself to that point of obedience. Therefore, God has highly exalted him. He exalted him at the proper time. And that's what we have to look forward to. If we will humble ourselves under the mighty hand of God, humble ourselves to the point of obedience, to the point of obeying whatever the implanted word tells us to say. Just stop talking long enough to listen and in meekness receive that implanted word and just receive it into obedience, receive it, allow it to become a part of your life and move you in this direction. So, fading back in the text just a little bit, just before he gave us this example about Christ, he tells us in verse 3, do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit. In humility, count others more significant than yourself. In humility, count others more significant than yourself. You know, this to me it's a two-sided thing. It's describing two things. When we're talking about walking with humility, being humble people, we're talking about our relationship with God, humbling ourselves under his mighty hand, but then also walking with humility toward each other. And that's where this is talking about, in humility, counting others as more significant than ourselves. So it's one thing to say, okay, well, God, I'm going to humble myself under your hand. I know that you're greater than me. I know, I can't walk in pride with you. But then we'll still go out and walk with pride among our fellow man. We'll still act pridefully around and among each other. But here he's telling us to count others as more significant than ourselves. I think, or I'd like you to connect that in your mind to Jeremiah's lesson from a couple weeks ago, the two greatest commandments. It seems like we talk about this all the time. Two greatest commandments. Why do we talk about them all the time? Because on these two depend all the law and the prophets. What are the two greatest? You love the Lord your God, love your neighbor as yourself. What does that have to do with humility? Well, God is asking us to, in humility, submit ourselves to him. And then in humility, he asks us to submit to one another. That's in the text there in 1 Peter 5. If you were in class this morning, submit to God, submit to one another. That's right there. So what does that look like? I know I've already asked that question. What does that look like? What does it look like to count others as more significant than yourself? I really want you to meditate on that. Just think about it. What does your life look like if you're putting others above yourself? What does your life look like? In this text, there's at least a couple of things, and then I'll kind of connect it to the conclusion. But in the next verse, verse 4, he says, let each of you look not only after his own interests, but also the interest of others. We talk about where rubber meets the road. This is rubber meets the road. If I'm going to, as verse 3 said, count others more significant than myself, I'm going to count them as more significant than myself. That means I'm not going to look after my own interests. I'm not only going to look after my own interests. I'm going to think about my brother's interests. I'm going to think about my brethren's interests. And I'm going to put their interests above my own. That's what that looks like. And again, you have to think about specifics in your life. You have to think about specifics in your life. How can I put others' needs above my own? How can I make sure that I'm not only focused on myself, in humility regarding others as more important than myself? Jesus, remember the example from the beginning in Matthew 20. If you want to be great in the kingdom, if you want to be great, become a servant. Learn how to serve. Learn how to serve. Yes, Jesus died on the cross, but he was also, every moment he was here, he was serving others. He washed their feet the night of his betrayal in an amazing example of service. But every day he lived, he was there serving others and trying to teach and trying to help. That's what it looks like. Don't look after your own interest. Look after the interest of others. Verse 7 describes Jesus being willing to empty himself and take on the form of a servant. That's what we've got to learn how to do. We've got to learn how to humble ourselves, yes, under the mighty hand of God, but we need to learn how to humble ourselves with one another and put others' needs above our own. Serve others. And that's difficult, but that's what we're asked to do. This passage, I should have flashed this before I made the point about connecting it to the two greatest commandments. But this, to me, in verse 5, you can see the second greatest commandment. This is the passage we started with. 1 Peter 5. Verse 5, the passage connects with the second greatest commandment. Love one another in humility. We are submitting to one another. And then in verse 6, humbling ourselves under the mighty hand of God. I see connections there to the first and the second greatest commandment. And so I want to use that as a springboard just to talk about this final point. I think true humility is seen in love. True humility is seen in love. If we really are humbled under the mighty hand of God, we will love him enough to keep his commandments. If you love me, you will keep my commandments, Jesus said. If we really love him, if we're really humbled under his hand, we will love him to the point of obeying his commandments. And then if we really love one another, if we really in humility are regarding others as more important than ourselves, if in humility I am placing others' needs above my own, what does that look like? It looks like love. If I'm really putting your needs above my own, it looks like love. And so I just want to go through 1 Corinthians 13 with you to conclude the lesson. 1 Corinthians 13, beautiful passage where it's talking about love. And as we go through each one of these things, I want you to see humility in each one of these things. Love is patient. Love is patient. What is required in order to be patient with someone? What is required in order to be patient? Do you not need humility? Do you not need in humility to put them above yourself? Put them above yourself and humbly put their interest above your own. Patience. Yes, it's love. Love is patient, but humility is required. Humility is required in order to have this attitude. What about kindness? Would you say the same thing? I think so. I think so. In order to be kind to someone, you are putting their needs above your own. You're in humility regarding them as more important than yourself, and you're in humility looking for ways to serve, looking for ways to do things for them. Some of these pretty obvious, I think. Does not envy, does not boast, is not arrogant. You know, that these things in so many ways you can see connections between this basic attitude that we've got to get and love. And in fact, I would say if you don't get this attitude right, if you don't get humility right, then you cannot get love right. You cannot get love right. We have to, in humility, submit to God, and in humility, submit to one another, put God above us, put others' needs above us, and not act in arrogance, and not boast, and not envy. Even rude, being rude. Why are we rude? Why does rudeness come out? There's some arrogance there, right? There's some pride that comes out. We are regarding ourselves as more important than them, and so we treat them with rudeness. We treat them with disdain because we don't love them as we should, but I would argue we don't love them as we should because we think higher of ourselves than we should. It's pride coming back and making us think higher of ourselves. This one's pretty obvious too. Does not insist on its own way. You know, does that not connect directly with Philippians 2? You know, you're not insisting on your own way. Instead, you are putting their needs above your own. So you can see, yes, love is what gets us to the end result, but humility is at the root of this love that we're trying to develop. Not irritable, not resentful. Does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. I just see a lot of connections with so many of these things. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things. Ultimately, love is the greatest commandment. Ultimately, love, all the law and the prophets hang upon love. But at its root, in order for us to have the right kind of love, we have to humble ourselves under the mighty hand of God. We have to allow our own will to be broken and put ourselves into submission under Him. As we learn how to do that properly, we will be putting ourselves under others. We will putting others' needs above our own. We'll be looking for ways to serve because that's what Christ did. That's what our Maker did. That's what He did. He came among us as one who served. And I'll tie this back to the very beginning. If we humble ourselves under the mighty hand of God, He will exalt us at the proper time. He will exalt us at the proper time. The problem with pride is we're trying to exalt ourselves at the improper time. We're trying to exalt ourselves in the way we want. And God says, no, you first learn how to humble yourself, and then I will exalt you at the proper time. I'll leave the lesson with you. I hope that these things have been profitable to consider. We'll conclude the service with an invitation, as we always do. If you know for whatever reason that your soul is not right with the Lord, if you have sin in your life that's not been dealt with, or perhaps you've never come to Jesus and submitted to baptism, whatever the case may be, if you know you're not right with the Lord, you have an opportunity to come forward, even if it's just to ask for the prayers of the saints. We would encourage you to come forward and make sure your soul is right before you leave here this evening as we stand and sing.